The quiet, frosty morning was the last peaceful moment for the caribou before the storm arrived. As the animal trotted across the snow-covered ground, it felt the wind shift, a chill unlike any it had ever encountered before. The dense pine forest surrounding the meadow was silent, eerily still. Its sharp hooves pressed lightly against the frozen surface, the only sound being the crunch of snow beneath its feet. Yet the air was heavy with a premonition, a warning that something darker was approaching. The first few gusts of wind pushed against the caribou's body, but it shrugged them off, not yet sensing the danger looming. Far in the distance, the sky darkened, a line of gray clouds unfurling, twisting and pulling at the horizon. In the blink of an eye, the calm was shattered as the storm's first blast cut through the open fields. Snowflakes swirled violently in the air, and the caribou's fur stood on end as the temperature dropped drastically. The beast's heart raced. The storm had come, and there was no turning back now. The caribou's breath came in heavy puffs as it fought against the storm's fury. Snow pelted its face, and the wind howled like an unseen predator, pushing against it, trying to force it off course. Its instinct screamed at it to find shelter, but the dark forest was still too far away. Its legs burned with exhaustion, each step a battle against the elements. In the distance, it thought it saw a glimmer of refuge, an outcropping of rocks, just barely visible through the swirls of snow. The caribou focused on that glimmer, drawing all of its strength into a final push. But with each moment, the storm seemed to grow more ferocious, almost as if it was fighting back, as though the world itself had turned against the caribou. With the forest still too far away, the caribou had no choice but to fight for survival, determined to push forward no matter the cost. As the caribou neared the rocky outcrop, the storm's fury intensified. The wind howled like a living creature, biting at the caribou's skin with icy teeth. Its muscles screamed in protest, but it pushed forward, reaching the shelter of the rocks just as the storm unleashed its full might. Behind the outcrop, the snow shifted in waves, creating a natural barrier against the wind. The caribou collapsed onto the cold stone, its sides heaving as it caught its breath. For a moment, it could only listen to the roar of the storm outside, the cacophony of wind and snow, a constant reminder of how close it had come to being overwhelmed. Inside this temporary refuge, the caribou could feel the warmth of its own body, a small comfort in the otherwise freezing world. But even here, it was not safe. This brief respite would not last long. The caribou lay there motionless, trying to conserve its energy. The wind seemed to press against the rocks as if it were trying to tear them from their foundations. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as the storm raged on. The animal's mind raced, filled with conflicting thoughts. Was it safe to move? Should it wait for the storm to pass? Or was it only delaying the inevitable? As the minutes stretched into hours, the caribou could feel the weight of the storm pressing in from all sides. It was becoming harder to breathe, the air growing thicker with the falling snow. But somewhere deep inside, it knew the storm wouldn't let up soon. And so, it made a decision. The only way out of this nightmare was to keep moving, to keep fighting the elements until the storm finally relented. With a deep breath, the caribou rose, legs shaking from exhaustion. The wind outside was still ferocious, but it had to move, had to push through. The shelter of the rocks wasn't enough to protect it for long. Every fiber of its being screamed for rest, but survival depended on action. It took its first tentative step into the storm once more, its hooves crunching on the frozen earth. Each step felt heavier, each gust of wind more painful than the last. The caribou could feel the cold sinking into its bones, but it refused to give in. The forest was still far, but it had to get there, had to find safety before it succumbed to the storm's merciless wrath. With a deep breath, the caribou surged forward, its movements growing more determined as the storm raged around it. The caribou pushed forward through the storm, its body aching with every movement. The snow was blinding, and the wind screamed in its ears. Its breaths came in short, frantic gasps, its heart pounding. The distant forest seemed impossibly far away, but it kept its focus on that one goal. It could see nothing ahead but swirling white, yet it knew it had no choice but to keep moving. Behind it, the storm roared louder, relentless, and unforgiving. The caribou's legs burned, its muscles protesting every step, but it continued on. As it stumbled over a patch of ice, the fear of being caught in the blizzard paralyzed it for a split second. But then, the determination surged once more. It had survived the worst of the storm so far, and there was no turning back. With the wind howling like a furious beast, the caribou pressed on, drawing strength from the instinct that pushed it towards safety, towards survival. In the distance, the caribou spotted a flicker of movement, a shadow passing through the snow. It froze, its breath catching in its chest. Was it another animal, or was the storm playing tricks on its exhausted mind? The shadow came closer, and the caribou could make out the shape of a figure. A wolf, moving swiftly through the storm. The predator's eyes locked onto the caribou for a moment, a fleeting exchange of understanding. The caribou's heart skipped a beat, and it immediately turned, sprinting faster than it had ever run before. The wolf, driven by hunger, began to pursue. The snow and wind made it harder for the caribou to gain distance, but it had a head start. Its hooves pounded against the frozen ground, sending sprays of snow into the air. It had no choice but to run for its life, knowing that the storm was not the only threat it now faced. The chase was on. The caribou could hear the wolf's breathing, heavy and relentless, growing closer with every second. Its muscles screamed in protest, but the caribou knew it couldn't stop now. The forest was still too far, and the wolf was closing the gap. The animal's instincts kicked in, pushing it to the brink of exhaustion. The caribou darted between trees, using the terrain to its advantage, hoping the wolf's smaller, more nimble frame would struggle with the obstacles in the forest. For a brief moment, it thought it might have lost the predator, until it heard the wolf's growl echoing through the trees. The chase was far from over. The caribou glanced ahead, scanning the forest for an escape route, but the snow continued to fall heavily, blurring its vision. The world had become a maze of white, and the caribou's only hope was to outrun the predator before it was too late. Just as the caribou was beginning to feel the wolf's teeth nip at its heels, a deafening roar pierced the air. The forest seemed to shake as a massive avalanche thundered down from the mountain slopes above. The snow crashed into the trees, sending a wave of icy terror down the hillside. The caribou had no time to think. It could only react. In one fluid motion, it turned sharply, its hooves digging into the snow as it dashed toward a nearby ridge. The wolf hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by the avalanche's fury. The caribou, using this brief moment of opportunity, bolted toward the edge of the ridge, narrowly avoiding being buried by the falling snow. The avalanche, however, was relentless. The ground shook beneath its hooves, and the caribou felt the tremor in its bones. It leaped, clearing a small gap between the ridge and a cluster of rocks that offered a fleeting glimpse of safety. The caribou landed on the other side of the ridge, its body tumbling briefly before it regained its footing. Snow continued to pour down, and the sound of the avalanche echoed in the distance. The wolf had not followed, likely trapped or buried in the onslaught of snow. The caribou stood still for a moment, its chest heaving as it took in the destruction around it. The forest, once a haven of refuge, was now a labyrinth of obstacles and danger. It could feel the exhaustion creeping into its limbs, its muscles trembling from the ordeal. But in that moment, the caribou realized something. It had survived. The predator had been outpaced, and the avalanche had bought it time. It could still make it to the forest, still find shelter. The storm had tested its will to live, but it had proven resilient. With a renewed sense of determination, the caribou pushed forward, deeper into the forest, its path uncertain but its spirit unbroken. The caribou had pushed deeper into the forest, seeking shelter among the towering pines. The wind howled through the trees, but here at least, it was a little quieter, the thick trunks blocking some of the worst of the storm. However, the respite was short-lived. The snow continued to fall heavily, the ground thick with layers of ice and slush that made every step a struggle. The caribou's muscles were aching, its limbs growing stiff from the cold. The once welcoming forest now felt like a trap, the trees closing in, their dark silhouettes looming like silent watchers. Each step was slower than the last, the snow deepening around its hooves. The caribou's breath misted in the air, heavy and labored. A sense of isolation settled over it. This wasn't a place for safety. It was a place of survival. With no clear path ahead, the caribou moved forward, its resolve faltering but never fully breaking. The storm was relentless, and the forest offered no comfort. The caribou stumbled on a patch of ice, nearly falling as its hooves slid beneath it. Instinctively, it regained its balance, but the fall had drained what little energy it had left. Its legs felt like lead, each movement slower than the last. It could feel the sharp sting of the cold seeping into its bones, and the wind seemed to bite deeper now, each gust a painful reminder that the storm was showing no signs of relenting. The caribou paused, leaning against a nearby tree to rest for a moment, eyes closing as it tried to recover. The storm, however, didn't give it the luxury of rest. A fierce gust of wind blew through the trees, causing the branches to creak and groan. Snow and ice rained down from the treetops, covering the caribou's back with a fresh layer of frost. The caribou's breathing grew shallow, the fatigue almost overwhelming. It had to keep moving, or it wouldn't survive. Survival, it realized, was no longer just a fight against the storm. It was a fight against time. After what felt like an eternity, the caribou forced itself to its feet once more. The storm had not relented. If anything, it had grown worse. The trees around it seemed to bend and twist under the pressure of the wind, their branches snapping and creaking in protest. The caribou's vision was limited, the snow blurring everything beyond a few feet in front of it. Yet, somewhere deep inside, it could feel the pull of instinct guiding it forward. There had to be something ahead, a cave, a shelter, something that could provide a haven from the storm. Its legs were trembling from exhaustion, but the animal's will to survive pushed it onward. Each step was more of a battle, but it wasn't ready to give in yet. Every time it felt the overwhelming urge to collapse, it thought of the forest, the shelter, and the warmth of safety. But that warmth seemed impossibly far away, lost somewhere in the ever-deepening white. As the caribou stumbled deeper into the storm, it finally caught a glimpse of something in the distance, a faint shape, barely visible through the thick falling snow. It was a dark silhouette, an outcropping of rock nestled against the mountain slope. The caribou's heart quickened, a surge of hope rising within it. Shelter. It wasn't much, but it was a chance. Pushing past the pain in its legs and the overwhelming cold, the caribou forced its body to move faster, each step a laborious effort. The storm continued its attack, snow and wind clawing at the caribou's sides, but it kept its focus on the distant outcrop. The snow was getting deeper, the path more treacherous, but the caribou refused to stop. It was so close. The outcrop loomed larger, and the caribou surged toward it, propelled by the thought of temporary safety. Its every movement felt like an act of defiance against the storm's wrath. The caribou reached the outcrop, its legs buckling as it finally found some reprieve. It collapsed against the cold rock, its body shivering uncontrollably as it tried to catch its breath. The wind battered the rocks around it, but the outcrop provided some protection. The caribou's sides heaved as it tried to recover from the relentless storm. But the shelter was fleeting. More snow and wind were already starting to whip around the sides of the rock. It wasn't much of a refuge, but it was enough for now. As the caribou huddled against the rock, the sound of the storm grew distant, muffled by the thick layers of snow surrounding it. The caribou closed its eyes for a brief moment, the storm's rage still echoing in its mind. But it had survived. The thought of the forest, still unreachable but close, was enough to give it hope. Tomorrow, it would try again. But for now, there was only the silence of the snow and the fragile peace of this moment. The caribou rested against the rock for what felt like hours. The storm had not relented, but it had weakened slightly, enough for the caribou to gather the strength it needed. It was a delicate balance. The storm still raged in the distance, its fury only partially blocked by the mountain slope. The caribou knew it couldn't stay here forever. The shelter provided some relief, but it wasn't a long-term solution. The snow continued to pile up around it, making the surrounding landscape even more treacherous. The outcrop, though a small sanctuary, would not protect it for long. The animal's instincts told it that there was still a chance, a final push to the forest that might bring the warmth and safety it so desperately needed. With a deep breath, the caribou pushed itself to its feet, legs trembling beneath the weight of the storm and its exhaustion. Every muscle in its body screamed for rest, but there was no choice now. It had to move, or the storm would claim it. With a final push, the caribou began its journey again, stepping out from the protection of the rocks. The wind slapped against its face, sharp and biting, as the snow swirled violently around it. Every step forward felt like a battle, its hooves sinking deeper into the snow with each movement. The trees in the forest were still a distant silhouette, but the caribou pushed on, its resolve hardening with every passing second. The forest was close now, closer than ever before. Yet, the deeper it moved into the storm, the more challenging the terrain became. Ice coated the ground, and the snow was relentless, swirling up in blinding gusts. The caribou's muscles were trembling with fatigue, but it could not afford to stop. The forest represented hope, safety, life. The storm may have been fierce, but the caribou's will to survive burned brighter than ever. It had come too far to turn back now. As the caribou pressed on, it found the going harder with each passing minute. The snow had become a wall, thick and unyielding, and the gusts of wind forced it to lower its head to navigate. The ground was uneven, filled with pockets of ice that threatened to make it slip with every step. The trees ahead seemed to grow more distant with every movement, the storm's intensity warping the landscape. The caribou's body was on the edge of breaking, but it couldn't give in. Not now. The trees were closer, almost within reach. But then, a sudden and sharp crack echoed through the air. A massive tree, weakened by the storm, began to fall. It toppled toward the caribou, a danger it had not seen coming. The animal's heart raced as it darted to the side, narrowly avoiding the falling tree. The ground shook as the tree crashed down behind it, sending waves of snow and debris in all directions. The caribou barely had time to breathe before continuing its dash toward the safety of the trees. The caribou continued its dash toward the forest, the trees now looming just ahead. The falling tree had shaken it, but it didn't stop. It couldn't. The forest was close now, the dark trunks offering a glimpse of refuge. The wind was still fierce, the snow falling thick and fast, but the caribou could sense the change in the air. The temperature was dropping, and it felt a shift in the environment, something that made it feel as though the storm's grip was beginning to loosen. It surged forward, gaining momentum, its legs growing more confident with every stride. The trees were almost within reach. But as the caribou neared the forest edge, it heard something else, footsteps behind it. A predator moving swiftly through the snow. The caribou's instincts flared. The forest might offer safety, but it wasn't certain. It could be a trap. It glanced over its shoulder and saw the shadow of the wolf closing in, the animal still hungry and determined. The caribou could either make it to the forest or face a final showdown. With one final burst of energy, the caribou reached the edge of the forest, leaping over a fallen log to enter the cover of the trees. The wolf, close behind, slowed as it reached the forest's edge, unsure of what to do next. The caribou's heart pounded in its chest, and its breath came in ragged gasps. It had made it into the forest, but the danger wasn't over yet. The trees provided shelter from the storm, but there were still predators in the shadows, and the storm was far from finished. The caribou, now hidden beneath the dark canopy, took a moment to gather itself, its body trembling from the exertion. It knew it had made it further than it ever expected. But in this world of snow and predators, safety was an illusion. The caribou's fight for survival wasn't over, not yet. It glanced into the darkened depths of the forest, where unknown dangers awaited. It would have to continue to fight if it wanted to see the light of another day. The caribou stood deep within the forest, its body heaving with exhaustion. The storm had not relented, but the shelter of the trees offered a fragile protection. Its muscles ached with the weight of the journey, every breath a labor. The snow beneath it had become deeper, more treacherous, and its hooves sunk in with every step. Yet, despite the physical toll, the caribou couldn't stop. The forest felt vast and overwhelming, the dense trees offering no clear path forward, just an endless maze of trunks and snow. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of wet wood and snow, and the biting cold seemed to pierce through the caribou's fur. Despite the storm's fury, it knew it had to push forward. The forest was still the safest place it could find, but the more it moved through it, the more apparent it became. Survival was a constant battle. Even in this relative safety, danger lurked in the shadows, and the caribou's journey was far from over. The caribou's steps grew slower, its head drooping slightly with the weight of exhaustion. Every breath felt heavier than the last, and it could feel the storm's chill creeping into its bones, even beneath the shelter of the trees. But there was no time to rest, no time to pause. The forest seemed to close in around it, the snowflakes swirling between the trees like silent predators, and the feeling of isolation became almost unbearable. The caribou's senses were heightened, every snap of a twig or rustle of snow sending a jolt of alertness through its body. It was being hunted, and it wasn't just the storm it had to fear. The predator from before, the wolf, was still out there, somewhere in the forest, waiting for its moment. The caribou quickened its pace, the urgency in its movements reflecting the growing panic within. Each step was a struggle, but it had no choice. The only way out of the storm, out of danger, was forward. The forest began to change. The dense trees thinned, and the snow became more manageable. The caribou found itself on a narrow path, a sliver of hope in the otherwise overwhelming landscape. It moved faster now, its movements growing more fluid as the terrain allowed it to navigate with ease. For a moment, it thought it might have a chance, that it might finally escape the storm and the predator that had relentlessly pursued it. But just as it felt the tension begin to lift, a flash of movement caught its eye. The wolf had appeared again, its eyes glowing in the shadows of the forest. It had been tracking the caribou all along, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Without hesitation, the caribou turned and bolted, its legs pushing it to its maximum speed. The wolf was fast, but the caribou was fueled by desperation and fear. This was a race, and there would be only one survivor. The chase was relentless. The caribou pushed forward, its hooves pounding against the frozen earth. The wolf, agile and sleek, was gaining on it, its growls echoing through the forest. The caribou's muscles burned with fatigue, but it refused to stop. The path ahead was unclear, the trees narrowing as it descended deeper into the forest. It could feel the wolf's breath on its heels, the animal's proximity a constant reminder of the danger. The snow continued to fall heavily, making every step a treacherous one. Suddenly the caribou heard a snap, a tree branch breaking in the distance. It was then that the caribou realized there was no escape. The predator was not alone. More wolves, emerging from the shadows, had joined the chase. The caribou's heart raced as it pushed itself harder, its every instinct telling it to flee. But the forest was closing in. There was nowhere left to run. The caribou's body was nearly spent, its legs giving out beneath it. But just as the wolves were about to close in, a sudden crack of thunder rumbled through the air, louder than the howling wind. The storm had reached its peak. The sky tore open, and a massive avalanche began to cascade down the mountainside. The ground trembled beneath the caribou's hooves, as the earth seemed to shift and move. In a desperate final push, the caribou lunged toward the trees, diving into the underbrush just as the avalanche hit. Snow and debris rained down in torrents, burying everything in its path. The wolves, caught in the avalanche, were swept away, their pursuit abruptly ended. The caribou lay still, its chest rising and falling with ragged breaths as the snowstorm raged on. It had survived, but at what cost? The storm had spared it, but it had not come without sacrifice. The journey was far from over, and the caribou knew it had only just begun to understand what true survival meant. The caribou lay still for a moment beneath the snow, its body numb and sore from the avalanche's force. The storm continued to rage, its fury unabated. Slowly, the caribou pushed itself free from the snow, struggling to rise to its hooves. Its breath came in shallow gasps, its sides heaving from exhaustion, but it had survived. The avalanche had done what the wolf could not. It had driven the predators away. The snowstorm, while brutal, had provided the caribou with a brief moment of peace. As it stood in the aftermath of the avalanche, the world around it felt different, quiet, eerily still. The forest that had once felt so confining now seemed like an open space, a place where survival was possible. Yet, despite the brief respite, the caribou knew it could not stop. The storm was still very much alive, and its fight was far from over. Each step it took would be a struggle, but the animal's resolve had only grown stronger. The caribou's legs shook with the strain as it began to move, step by step, through the thick snow. The storm had calmed slightly, but the ground was treacherous. The ice beneath the snow was hard and slippery, making every move a calculated risk. The wind, though less intense, still whipped through the trees, howling like a distant cry. Yet, despite the harsh conditions, the caribou felt a flicker of something within, an ember of hope. The forest ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, but the shelter it promised felt within reach. The caribou's muscles burned with every step, but the thought of safety kept it moving forward. It wasn't just the storm it had to face anymore. It was the challenge of finding the strength to continue when every ounce of its being screamed for rest. But survival wasn't about comfort. It was about pushing through the pain, about outlasting the storm, no matter the odds. As the caribou pushed forward, it came upon a familiar landmark, a small clearing that it had passed earlier in its journey. It felt a strange sense of relief, knowing it was not entirely lost. The trees here were less dense, the snow less deep, and there was a brief moment of peace. However, that peace was short-lived. The caribou's senses were on high alert, and it could hear the faintest sound, a rustling in the underbrush. It froze, its body tense. In the distance, a shadow moved. It was another predator, creeping silently through the snow, hunting. The caribou's heart began to race, but it quickly realized that it was not yet in danger. The predator, a lynx, paused as it caught sight of the caribou, then slinked away, recognizing the caribou as too formidable a foe. The caribou let out a quiet breath, its body trembling from the adrenaline. It wasn't safe yet, but it had once again narrowly escaped danger. The brief encounter with the lynx left the caribou shaken, but it didn't allow itself to stop. The thought of the predator lingering in the shadows fueled its need to keep moving. The clearing was a false sense of safety, and the caribou knew it had to press on. As it moved deeper into the forest, the terrain began to change again. The snow thinned out, and the trees grew farther apart, making way for an open expanse of frozen ground. The storm's force had left the air sharp and clear, the horizon visible in the distance. The caribou quickened its pace, the wide open space offering both freedom and danger. It could see the outline of a mountain range far ahead, a possible escape from the storm and the predators. The path was uncertain, but the promise of open skies urged the caribou onward. It was a race now, a race against the storm, against nature itself, and against the creeping exhaustion that threatened to overcome it. The caribou's heart pounded as it made its way across the frozen expanse, the mountain range growing closer with every step. The storm was finally subsiding, the snow lessening in intensity, but the caribou was too tired to feel anything but the overwhelming need to find shelter. Its body was near collapse, but the promise of the mountains kept it going. As it reached the base of the range, it noticed a small cave, its entrance partially concealed by rocks and snow. With a final burst of strength, the caribou made its way toward the cave, its legs shaking beneath it as it pushed through the snow. It stumbled inside, collapsing to the ground, its body shuddering with exhaustion and relief. For the first time in what felt like forever, the caribou felt a measure of peace. The storm had nearly broken it, but it had survived. The mountain offered refuge, and as the caribou lay there, the storm's echoes began to fade, leaving only the quiet sounds of survival. The caribou rested within the cave, its body recovering from the punishing storm. The world outside was still, the cacophony of wind and snow now replaced by a profound silence. The storm had passed, leaving only remnants of its fury, the once violent winds now a whisper in the distance. The caribou's muscles, though still sore, began to relax, the tension in its limbs slowly melting away. It closed its eyes for a brief moment, allowing itself to fully rest for the first time in what seemed like an eternity. But even as it rested, the caribou knew it couldn't stay in this place forever. The world beyond the cave was no longer an unforgiving expanse of snow and wind. It was something else now, something that it could conquer. But it wasn't just the journey ahead that weighed on its mind. It had survived the storm, but there was a deeper truth. It had been transformed. The wilderness had shaped it, and now it had to decide what came next. As the days passed, the caribou grew stronger. The storm had left the landscape transformed, the world outside no longer an impenetrable wall of snow. The mountain range, which had once seemed so distant, now felt closer, offering the caribou a new perspective on its journey. The caribou ventured from the cave, stepping cautiously into the world beyond. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and the winds had calmed. Its body still bore the scars of the storm, its fur matted with frost and ice, but it was no longer the same animal that had first set foot in the blizzard. It had endured the worst of nature's wrath and emerged stronger for it. As it made its way through the quiet snow-covered landscape, it realized that survival was not simply about enduring the elements. It was about learning to adapt, to grow, and to accept that the challenges faced in the wild were not obstacles, but opportunities for change. The caribou moved through the snow-covered terrain, its steps slower but more deliberate now. The world around it had shifted. The forest no longer seemed like a labyrinth of dangers, but a place of quiet refuge. The caribou's hooves made soft crunching sounds as they pressed through the fresh snow. With every step it felt more at ease, more connected to the land that had once seemed so hostile. The once dominating storm was now a distant memory, and the caribou had learned to move with the rhythms of nature, adapting its every step to the terrain. It paused for a moment, lifting its head to gaze at the horizon. In the distance, the first signs of spring were beginning to emerge. The snow that had once seemed endless was now breaking, and the sun's warmth was starting to melt the harsh ice beneath its hooves. The caribou, though scarred by its ordeal, had emerged victorious, ready for whatever challenges the coming seasons might bring. As the days wore on, the caribou found itself navigating the landscape with a new sense of purpose. The forest, once a place of danger, now felt like a familiar home. The caribou moved through the trees with ease, its steps steady and its body strong. Yet, there was a lingering feeling within, a quiet reminder of the trials it had faced. The journey had changed it, and though it had found shelter in the forest, it had also found something deeper within itself. It had learned the value of perseverance, of resilience, and of embracing the unknown. The storms had tested it, but they had also shaped it into something greater. The caribou now moved not just through the forest, but with the forest, as if the land itself had become a part of it. It was no longer an outsider to the wild. It was a part of it, one with the rhythm of the earth, the wind, and the shifting seasons. The caribou stood at the edge of a clearing, watching as the first signs of dawn broke across the sky. The world was still, the landscape bathed in the soft glow of early morning light. The storm that had once defined its journey now felt like a distant memory, a challenge that had shaped it into something new. The caribou had come a long way from the wild, chaotic storm that had nearly claimed its life. It had fought, adapted, and learned to survive. And now, standing at the edge of the world it had once feared, the caribou felt a quiet peace. The world was still dangerous, but it no longer felt insurmountable. The caribou had earned its place in the wild, and it had come to understand that survival wasn't just about the fight. It was about finding strength in the struggle, peace in the chaos, and knowing when to stand still and reflect on the journey that had brought it here.